New Bottles by Moses David. Written June the 28th, 1973. Letter number 251. We've all had to forsake something to serve the Lord. To forsake education would seem a handicap. Some of his formal education is one of the things Hosea, for example, had to sacrifice, but the Lord clearly spoke to my heart about it and said, "Yes, but what if he had not done so? What if we had agreed that we shouldn't take our children out of school so soon? Aaron and Faith barely made it through high school, Ho barely through junior high. Imagine. The world would think we were absolutely crazy trying to run a worldwide revolution with junior high graduates." It's rather like that poem about Old Testament Israel. It's odd that God should choose the Jews, which also has the answer. He chose, which shows God knew his Jew. Apparently God knew Hosea didn't need a formal education, and that there would be plenty of people to do the jobs that required it for him. Like Henry J. Kaiser, the steel billionaire, said when they asked him if he didn't need more education. Didn't he find his lack of education was a handicap in his career? And he said no, not a bit. While the guys who are now working for me who needed the education to do what they're doing were getting that education, I was getting the kind of education I needed. I was out dreaming and building things and making things and dreaming up the things they were going to figure out how to build. The details would be their job while working for me years later. I let them get the education while I had the ideas and the dreams and thought up the things which they had the education to then perfect. I never got my degree in engineering, but those who did are now working for me. But the main thing the Lord pointed out to me while I was praying for Ho was, what if he had refused to start when he did? Because it was our children who started the revolution with Mother's help and my teaching. Of course, it was our upbringing and training and faith and vision, etc., that helped inspire them to do what they did. It was sort of like we trained the little fighting cocks and then stood back and sicked them on the world, and they went to it. Hosea had to be available and willing to give up his education in order to strike out on the road and go witnessing and invade those territories and finally invade Huntington Beach and the club. It had to be done by youth. I could go in later and teach them, but if you kids hadn't gotten them together first with the message and the method, it never would have happened when it did or the way it did. If you hadn't, probably God would have chosen some way or someone else. But I don't know who else had the message and the vision and the faith and the guts to do what we did and be the first fools to try it like we were. But if they hadn't been willing to give up their normal pursuits of so-called normal youth, when would the revolution have started? And in fact, who would have started it? You kids had to begin at the age you did to reach that age who was still in high school. I'm nothing but the old battle veteran that's been there and can now counsel you how to fight the war. In fact, if I were to go out on the streets in front-line action to reach youth, the reaction would probably be the one that happened the first time I went down to the club in Huntington Beach in my old jacket and black beret. I deliberately staggered into the club and flopped down in a dark corner to see what was going on. As I lay down, sprawled in the corner, I said, "What the hell's going on in here? What's this all about?" Most of the kids didn't even pay any attention to me. They were used to a lot of old drunks coming in now and then. But there was a kid sitting about 6 or 8 feet from me, and after I'd made a few blurting remarks, the kid looked around rather sympathetically at me and said, "Oh, hi there. What's your trip, Dad?" So I thought, well, I see right now there's no use trying to fool these kids. I'm Dad to them. No use trying to fool them into thinking I'm a hippie. That lets me out. And I kind of got a pin poked in my balloon. The Lord had told me I was to be king of the beggars, and I was trying to play it their way and become one of them, and that way didn't work, except that I could sympathize with them and appreciate their problems and give them fatherly guidance and counsel. So that almost brought an end to my career of trying to be a hippie. Reminds me of the time I went down to our amphitheater music show on Huntington Beach and was trying to counsel and advise them on the side how to set things up for the meeting they were having. As I strolled up behind them and whispered to someone to change the mic, etc., one of the kids said, "Who's that old Jew down there trying to give you all that trouble, trying to tell you what to do? Who does he think he is, anyway?" So it would have been ridiculous for me to try to reach youth at my age at that particular time. I can reach them now that they know me, and they understand, through the letters. But really, if I tried to hit the streets now in person, I wonder if they'd listen. How could you know anything about our problems? You are 3 or 4 times as old as we are. So it took you kids to do it and get it started. Youth had to reach youth. And how could you have done it if you weren't still young enough to do it? And how could you be young enough to do it if you hadn't dropped out of school? You had to set the example in order to persuade others to drop out. Otherwise, they would have always been accusing you of getting more education than they did. My kids dropped out before it was even legal to drop out, because I just took them out and took off, and just kept moving from state to state. When they did go to school, they went to as many as 9 schools in 1 year. So we started the Jesus Revolution, which has swept the world, and is now in about 50 countries, reaching the youth of the world. And our message has circled the globe, and the news media has published it around the world. They've heard of the message and the messengers, and it was all started by the Lord through 2 high school graduates and 1 junior high graduate, and just 2 old folks behind the scenes urging them on and making it possible for them to do it. If we hadn't been willing to pay the price as parents, first of all to train and to encourage you to do it, and to risk our lives and reputations and even the law to encourage you to drop out of the system at junior and senior high school level, the revolution might have been delayed or never gotten started at all. We old folks, Mum and I, first forsook our denomination and reputation and relatives and even our own former ways of thinking. You can be so thankful you didn't have all that system background to have to overcome. We'd had so much indoctrination to be brainwashed of, such as church doctrines, etc. So much of it junk that wasn't even so, and things they told us that weren't even necessary, and things they failed to tell us to do that really needed to be done. So that was our big battle, to get rid of what you, thank God, don't have to go through, all that education and mental conditioning and church indoctrination. Forsaking all that was a real psychological and spiritual wrench, especially hard on your mother. But she didn't realize she was going to attain to one of the greatest sainthoods the world has ever known through being a little hippie, a real revolutionary, an outcast. And it wasn't too easy for me to drop out of my job, my work, my church, and all I had been trained for. But now I can see the Lord was training me, not the church, or the school, or the army, or the government, or big business. I had a lot of experiences in the system, but what I learned from them didn't do me much good, except to teach me to hate it. But I can see now a lot of things the Lord trained me in, which I got outside of business and the army and church and school, which now are far more valuable than what I learned in church or in school or in the army or in business, although everything we learn God eventually usually uses in some way to teach you to do something. But when I look back personally, I'm comparing now myself to your own preparation, and realize nearly all the training I got was to be a church preacher, and my greatest ambition was to be a great singer for the Lord and try to move the hearts of these dead church people, it all seems a big waste of time. I'm singing a new song for which church singing never prepared me whatsoever, and preaching a new message that church preaching and Bible college never taught me at all. So, because we got too much education and had too much church and too much of the wrong kind of preparation, we had too much to overcome. So, Mom and I had to make the first break and become the first dropouts. But by the time we had made it, it was too late for us to carry it out and reach others. Like Karl Marx, by the time he got his book on communism all written down, he died, and others had to carry out his plans. Nearly everything I'm teaching and writing now, I really taught my own kids, with a few exceptions, and they already have it. So God had to use them, young people who had received this revolutionary training, who were not contaminated by the system or education or churchianity. We, Mother and I, had to be the first dropouts. But then to reach the younger generation, we had to rear our children from scratch the revolutionary way, because we were too old to get the job done ourselves, personally. So we had to rear some little revolutionaries to lead and witness and be a sample and reach their generation with what we had taught them. That was the education they received, the kind of education I wish I had received. This revolution literally took 4 generations, the preparation of 4 generations to develop the 4th generation at a young enough age to get it started. My grandfather was a radical rebel revolutionary for his day, but he wasn't really revolutionary enough. He was considered a radical and fighter and crusader, but what was he fighting? Some old has-beens of the system. He just took a few steps in the right direction, so that when my mother came along, he trained her to go a little further, and then she got so far out it got him scared. He thought she'd become a real religious fanatic, and by the time I came along, with the good training they'd given me, they were too old, and they hadn't gone far enough, and it took another generation, me, so that by the time my mother was ready to pass on, she thought I'd gone too far. I'd gone beyond her. My grandfather's parents literally thought he'd gone too far. He never even received a college education, but later he became president of a college because he dropped out at an early age and became part of an acting troupe, and later read and studied and educated himself, and became so famous they conferred on him all kinds of degrees without his even working for them in formal schooling. If you get famous and well known enough, they'll give you any degree you want, just to get you to lecture for them. But he was a dropout. Here he was, a great orator in much demand as a college graduation speaker, but what could he tell them, he who had never even been to college? But he did tell them to drop out for the Lord, and thousands were saved, and at least 400 young men and women went into the ministry as a result of his work with them, and one of those men was instrumental in starting a whole new denomination. My grandfather was really a dropout, but only down to the university level. It took 3 generations of older people to produce this revolutionary generation, each generation coming a little further out. My grandfather, with his radical ideas and different ways of doing things, shocked his own denomination. Then my mother and father dropped out of that one to join a new and more fanatical denomination. Then Mom and I came along and dropped out of denominations entirely, in fact, finally out of the churches altogether. But it took that long to rear children that were not even brought up in church, except when they were very young. And Ho never had a job except selling newspapers. I don't think he ever worked for money in his life, except when he was 9 years old. In our case, it took 4 generations to purify the race and to get them as far as we have gotten to start a real revolution. But the revolution didn't even start with me and Mother, or even my grandfather. It's been going on for hundreds of years. God has been purifying each generation. There have been a few rebels, and St. Francis was trying. But as far as I know, there never was anyone who really totally and completely broke out of the church mold. You see, until we came, it didn't really matter who they were. Each movement just started another denomination and had a meeting house, and it ended up with, on a certain day of the week, coming to the building and hearing sermons. There were none who ever called themselves a revolution or a new nation. They all called themselves zany new names for churches. Everyone was trying to get back to the right church with the right name, and all those thousands of years, nobody ever called themselves officially the children of God. Really, the closest thing to us was Moses and the children of Israel when they first broke out of Egypt. But they still hadn't gone as far as we did, because they still had the temple and the priesthood and the services, and they hadn't all left their jobs, and they weren't all living in communes with everybody preaching and witnessing. Think how many generations it's taken to get this far. Each of us just carries things a step further. If it hadn't been for the preparation of each generation before, we wouldn't have gotten this far. We had to prepare you for the job. We had to drop out of church and education in order to rear you, our children, almost without it. You just had a little church and a little business and a little school. It was not your main thing. God is continually purifying and expunging a little more and brainwashing a little more. At the ages of 5, 6, 7, 9, and 10, our kids had already been trained in commando tactics of how to attack a churchyard parking lot with literature during services, sometimes rolling flat on their tummies under the cars to get away from the cops if necessary. So your combat training took that long. So don't ever be sorry when once in a while you feel a little handicapped because you don't know much about this or that. My Lord, if you'd gone on in school, you would have missed this generation. You'd just now be finishing college and going on to your postgraduate work, and you'd be an old has-been, too old for the revolution. So don't ever be sorry. Be thankful you don't have to go through what the former generations went through for you. You got the kind of training you needed for your job, and you can't have everything. You can't know everything. You got the kind of knowledge of tactics and methods you needed to know to do the job the Lord has given you. And that's all you need to know. But even you had a little bit of church and school and business. Now, do you realize we are now producing another generation, a new, more revolutionary generation? Your children haven't the faintest idea of what church is really like. Some of them don't even know what a school is like. They've never been, and they'll probably never hold a job of any kind and never earn a dime. They're going to be, I hope, the purest generation of all, totally revolutionary from the very beginning. They will never be sorry they had to leave the system because they've never been in it. They won't have to drop out because they've never been in. They've never known anything else but commune life, hippies, radicals and revolutionaries and long hairs and Bible and witnessing and passing tracts, 100% revolutionaries from the time they were born. My mother came out of the froth or cream of society, as she called it. She told how she stood on the corner preaching in San Francisco with Bridget, whose mother was a harlot born in a brothel. Bridget used to get a crowd by saying, "Step right up, men, I'll give you $1 if you can put your finger on one spot on my skin that doesn't show the sign of the dope needle." And she turned to my mother one day and said, "You know, Nina, how old were you when you first heard there were bad women like me?" My mother said, a little embarrassed, "I was in my teens." But Bridget said, "You know, I was in my teens before I heard there were any good women in the world who were not harlots. I was born and reared in the brothel and started being a harlot at the age of 12. That may be a kind of strange illustration, but the fact is that our kids, your children, the little ones being born now, will never have known anything but our kind of life. I'm hoping that these little children are going to be really pure revolutionaries from birth, and so far it looks like they are. The oldest children we have in the revolution are only around 9 or 10 or 12 so far. If we ever let them go to school or church at all, it will be to give them a taste of it, so they'll hate it. That's not to say they won't ever be tempted, just as my own children were. But apparently they didn't like it because they're still with us. Your children will be totally revolutionary, never knowing what churchianity and system jobs and education are like, and will have virtually never known anything but revolutionaries, born with them, eat with them, sleep with them, play with them, and witness with them. And when they see a systemite, they know one. In fact, they embarrass their parents by blurting out to their face, "You're a systemite." Our little kids will have never known anything else. We hope they'll never be contaminated by the system. They will have heard of it, like the kids in Russia will have heard of capitalism and capitalists, but most have never even seen one. Our little kids have never known anything but the revolution for Jesus, so I think we've just about done our best. Each of these generations of my family did their best. Each generation of Christians, at least some of them, have made some progress, bringing a little greater purification. Each denomination brought a new and needed thing, something the church needed. We're about the only group who really hasn't brought anything new to the church, because we're not even in the church, or churchianity so-called. We haven't brought anything to the church system. We've at last come completely out of it. We are the first really totally new kind of church. That's why God has called us the new church. We are totally different from any other kind of church ever born. The closest thing like us is either Moses and the children of Israel or the early church. But even some of the early church was still hanging on to their synagogues and old concision doctrines. But at least the children born in those early Christian groups were reared that way. They were probably one of the purest that ever was. The latter rain is closer to being like the early rain, the early church, than any churches in between, or before, or since. And there aren't going to be any since, because the Lord's going to come before then. Even the scientists say living space, food and oil are coming to an end, or pollution will destroy us. Somewhere in the 80s or 90s they all say it's got to come to an end, which is what the Lord's already told us. You should be very thankful you missed whatever you did miss, because it's all a part of the old system that you don't need and we're trying to sweep away. Now what about your children? Won't they be better than you? More revolutionary? An improvement on the stock? I can already see some signs of it in our old bottles, that even in our own ranks we've got people who are becoming old bottles and who are living in the past, which means they are part of an old system which existed 2 or 3 or 5 or more years ago, and therefore they are our old systemites of our new system. And I'm wondering, are you going to try to do what we did in this respect? Do you know why there is the Jesus Revolution today? It's because we taught you not to do it the way we had done it, because your mother and I were has-beens and had spent nearly all our lives in the churches, but we taught you to do it the way we wish we had done it, and the way in which it was too late for us to do it. We taught our kids to do what we wish we had done, and what was really too late for us to do. We taught you not to do it just like we always did it. Some things, yes, but most things, no. We really just did the best we could for you, and then turned you loose to find out how it needed to be done now for your own generation by going out and finding your own generation and what they needed and what they will accept and what would reach them, and doing it in ways we never used. We never had a coffee house. We had a soul clinic. The soul clinic is now an old has-been. No wonder it caved in and collapsed, working with a bunch of old bottles who never left churchianity or really revolutionized. We tried not to be old bottles to hold you back and make you do it the way the soul clinic did it, much less the way we did it in church, but to turn you loose and by the Spirit of God learn how to do it now. Every new day we need to know and learn and find out how to do it today. And for God's sake and your children's sake and the future of the world's sake and the last generation's sake, your children, for the sake of the end, I hope you will not try to limit your children even to the way you've been doing it, much less the way I've been doing it, but that you will let them do it their way, the way God shows them to do it in their way and their day for their generation. Otherwise, if you try to make them conform to yesterday, they will have become also old bottles and an old system and a thing of the past. Let's face it, you are already old bottles in a sense, because your children are going to have to do it differently from the way you're doing it, with new methods under different conditions, and they'll have to adapt themselves to the need of the day. So for God's sake, I can't tell you how to do everything, because I don't know,